I was sent to the dancing classes of Gwen Webster in Dunedin with a studio above a plumber's shop in Princess Street, just opposite the Fleming flour mills in Dunedin. And of course I was the only boy, and there were half a dozen little girls there, and we used to make a pyramid, and I was stuck right up on top, you know, and if anyone fell down it was always me. But I went there for quite a little while, but it wasn't until later on that I became conscious of the Royal Academy of Dancing, and then I changed to lessons with Lily Stevens. Lily Stevens was a remarkable woman. She'd been teaching clubs and dumbbells in Dunedin. I'm speaking about 1925 or 1926 now. We will talk more about this later. And she went to Paris to learn the special French terms which the Royal Academy of Dancing were using, which is foreign language to her, you see. And she came back so that she could talk about développé and allongé and vivace, you know, all the ballet terms which we know. And then, of course, about that time, too, the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo came with Anton Dolin and Rubashinska and Baronova. And I was an extra in their performances, but Dolin used to come and give classes at Lily Stevens' studio in Rattray Street in Dunedin. And he used to say to Lily, you know, you must devote a lot of attention to this young man because he's got to be a dancer, you see. And I didn't think for 1 minute I was a very great dancer or anything. But of course, then the war came, and that sort of messed everything up, you see. So overseas I went. Then when I returned after many, many years, and you see, I was no longer a young man, you must realize this. That's something else we'll speak of, because when I was first called up, I was turned down because I didn't breathe properly. But that was attended to. And then when I was called up the second time, but I was called up with a totally different batch of men. Now, had I gone with the original batch of men, I would have gone to Greece and Crete, and I would have been incarcerated. You know, I would have been good night. But because I'd gone up to Wellington, I went to Fiji and Norfolk Island and New Caledonia, and eventually struggled with the Japanese in the Treasury Islands with the 2nd NZEF. Then I came home to New Zealand on leave and went off. During this time, if ever I came back to Auckland, I took lessons from Valerie Valeska, who continued my RAD work, you see. She was a darling. Her real name was Valerie Scott, but she was called Madame Valeska, and had great panache, and was a very excellent teacher. When I came back to Auckland, when my army duty was finished, I'd learned that you could apply for a bursary to study ballet, or you could go and study under the auspices of the Return Services scheme. So I applied to be a ballet dancer, to go to the Sadler's Wells. It created a terrible stir even to somebody writing to the newspaper and saying that I had no right whatsoever, a soldier, to go and dance in London. You know, it brushed people up the wrong way. But anyhow, away I went and landed in London, no longer young and not very experienced, and but with the went to the Sadler's Wells School. My dear Monique was entirely disenchanted, for the great Sadler's Wells Ballet School for boys was just a room in a church hall out at Hampstead, and there were only about 5 boys in the class, including Peter Clegg, who became a very good dancer, and David Blair, who became a very, very, very great soloist with the Royal Ballet. But the teacher I had turned out to be a very good friend of mine later on, but she was Russian and she only spoke French. And you can imagine a very raw New Zealander, well and truly, I must have been 24, I suppose, or 25 by this time, far too late to be doing ballet, you know, from a teaching point of view. But I battled on, and the Sadler's Wells used me in quite a number of things, maybe just because they wanted an extra body, you know. And with the Sadler's Wells, I appeared with the Sadler's Wells Opera, and I appeared with the Vienna State Opera Company at Covent Garden. And but life was an enormous battle every time. And I also attended deplorable ballet classes by Ruth French. Now, Ruth French was a tall, slim, long-legged ballerina who had had great success many years before as a ballerina in a musical company. And she had a great reputation. But speaking to you from one teacher to another, she was the most dreadful teacher. To teach you to do pirouettes, she would sort of belt you on one shoulder and say, turn around, turn around, turn around. All that changed for me. One day, a lovely lady called Audrey Harmon, who was also at the Sadler's Wells School, said, there's an audition for the International Ballet, which I'm going to. Would you come with me? So I said, oh, yes, I would. Everywhere we went, you went with a bag with your ballet shoes and your jockstrap and your tights, you know. So we got to this Kensington studio downstairs with a parquet floor, deadly floor to dance on, hard as the hobs of hell.
Not a sprung for.
Great mirror at the one end, and a young lady sitting on a chair who gave us an enchaînement to do, and she whistled and clicked her fingers, and we danced in time to her whistling and dancing. So she said to Audrey, yes, she would like her to join her company, and she said to me, are you free? I told her I'd come from the Wells, and I said, oh yes, I was free. I was being paid £5 a week by the New Zealand government, and they paid my fees at the Sadler's Wells. And every time I appeared on stage with the Sadler's Wells, I received 2 and 6pence. And at about that time I had married too, see. So when the lady, who turned out to be Mona Inglesby, the ballerina of the International Ballet, offered me £7 a week, I immediately said yes. So off I went, renounced everything with the Sadler's Wells, which may have been the silliest thing I ever did in my life. However, you're wise after the event, but I didn't feel I would ever get any further with the Wells, for younger dancers were coming on, much more talented than I. And the Sadler's Wells was a very sort of English closed shop sort of attitude. It was very strange. And of course, I was a raw soldier from the 2nd NZEF. I could give an answer back to anybody. I'd been through the mill. When you woke up the next morning and found that the guy in the tent next to you had had his throat cut by the Japanese, things like that happened to you, or people were just blasted off the face of the earth. You got a new way of being with people, you know. Anyhow, so I joined the International Ballet, and Mona Inglesby was about to produce a full-length version of The Sleeping Princess under the maestro Sergeyev, who was from the Mariinsky. It was an authentic presentation of The Sleeping Beauty. Now, the Wells already did this at the Covent Garden in a most fabulous, lavish way, but it was not authentic. Different dancers were put in different places, and it was not as it was originally performed. But Mona Inglesby was mad about doing the classics in an authentic manner. And Swan Lake and Capella and Sleeping Pea were all done under Maestro Cicchetti's guidance. So I was along in the back row with half a dozen other young men. But as you know, Harold G. Robinson, there was plenty of eyes and teeth. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't very long before he got in the front row of all these young men. And then if there was a small solo to do, Harold would do that. And I actually became what they called in the company a leading dancer. If the mazurka was on, you led the mazurka. In Swan Lake, when in the Padesis of Spanish, I was one of the Spanish dancers, and I was a charas dancer and a mazurka dancer, and eventually made quite a name for myself, not as the leading dancer of the company, but a very important one of them, along with Harry Haythorne. But I was a little more fortunate than Harry. Harry, in those days, was a very raw Australian and a rather cheeky and naughty young man, and whereas least Harold G. Robinson, with his suburban mum, had been brought up to be polite. There was a different kettle of fish with Harry Haythorne, you see. Although Harry stayed with the company for many, many years after I had left. There were great opportunities when Mona Inglesby staged Dorothy Stevenson's Sea Legend, a ballet which I had seen in His Majesty's Theatre with the Australian company during the war. And Dorothy Stevenson's Sea Legend, with Martin Rubinstein as the young sailor, absolutely enthralled me. And I think that might have been the real spark that I dreamed that it would be just wonderful to be that young man in that particular ballet. And it was absolutely astounding that through circumstance, Mona Inglesby staged this ballet, and I was chosen to be the soloist at the Colosseum in London. It was absolutely incredible. A young lady who was writing a book about male dancing in New Zealand asked me about the story of Sea Legend, and it was such a fragmentary sort of story of a young man dancing on the golden sands of the seashore and the waves tossing in. The waves were the quarter ballet. And in the midst of it all appears a beautiful mermaid, and of course they have a loving pas de deux. I used to dance with Joyce Gearing. She was a lovely dancing, and Bridget Kelly. Two ladies shared the part. It was a joy to be with them. And the costume was magnificent. They wore long, long hair. Oh, it was made of plasticky sort of stuff, and it stuck all over the place. It looked as though she'd just come out of the sea, which of course she had, you see. And she entices the young man back into the city. But the monsters of the deep were not interested in having him there, and they hurled him about in the waves until, of course, he was drowned, and the curtain comes down as his lifeless body is hurled onto the footlights on the sand, and that's the end of the ballet. It was such a fragmentary story, but it was rather a joy, you know. And it was good for the International Ballet because although we did the classics regularly all the time, every now and again we would give a program of short ballets, and that would be one of them. Then later on, she staged another ballet called Illusions. It won the Grand Prix in Paris, and it had a whole number of typically French, I don't know what the word is, you know, there was sin and wickedness and hatred and love and all these things. Well, my role was called Red. It was sensuality, and it just suited me to the ground to be dressed in scarlet tights from top to toe. And I was given a solo part in that particular ballet, and that was rather a triumph for me too. See, in the meantime, we were still dancing the classics, you know, Swan Lake and Sleeping Pea and Coppelia. Of course, I was married at that time, and we were on tour. We gave dancing in Zurich, in Switzerland, and in Austria, and in Verona. And just last year, of course, I went back to Verona. We were unable to go into the arena, for it was being reconstructed. But it was rather exciting that years and years and years afterwards I went back to that place, you know, where I'd been dancing. I was very conscious at the time that I was on tour, and only came back to London and to Freda at the weekends, and not every weekend, you know. And I was always conscious of the fact that I wasn't getting any younger. And as Freda would say, I had a pleasing voice. So I thought, what am I going to do for later on in life? My greatest natural asset was my voice. So I went to the Windmill Theatre, and you will be bored of my story because I keep repeating to people, but I went for an audition, and Keith Lester, the ballet master, was sitting in the stalls, and Vivian Van Dam, and I was standing on stage, and I was singing away like mad. See, I've forgotten the name of the song. In any case, in the midst of the whole thing, Vivian Van Dam, applauding, said, "Thank you, Mr. Robinson." He said that was very pleasing, and he turned to Keith Lester and said, "Isn't Mr. Robinson a dancer?" And Keith Lester said, "Oh yes, he's with the International Ballet." So Van Dam, I can remember it as though it happened yesterday. Van Dam was a charming, mature, gracious, cosmopolitan Jewish man. Charming. He said quietly to me, "We could give you a job as a dancer if you would, as a singer. We will give you a job as a singer if you will dance for us." So I thought, oh damn, that's the very thing I didn't want to do. I was, however, they offered me, I think I got about £27 a week, which was colossal money, much more than I was getting at the International Ballet. And you realize I was married, and I no longer wanted to be relying upon the bursary. Well, it had stopped, I think, by that time. It only lasted for 3 years, you see, and it was only £5 a week. Paid the rent. But, so I got to the Windmill Theatre with Keith, forgotten his name.
Lester.
And, but, oh my goodness, it was hard work. 6 shows a day, and every 6 weeks a new show. And I had to learn 6 songs, 6 routines with the girls, and learn a bit of classical ballet on a glass floor with light sun shining up from underneath it. And it was just hard work all the time. We would do a series of 3 shows, and then you were given a sort of holiday for the next 6 weeks. You didn't appear. There were 2 companies with the Windmill Theatre, A company and B company, and you worked alternate days. But on the day off, you rehearsed for the next show. And I've often thought back about it. You were on stage after rehearsing for about, say, 2 3/4 hours, 2 hours 45 minutes. It wasn't very long. You had to be pretty slick. You had costume fittings, and the next show was hurriedly thrown together. I did everything. I would sing beautifully, dressed in top hat and tails, and then I would do a comedy act, dressed in a very large suit of armour, and then I would do a dance number of an Indian pearl diver in a G-string and a few ropes of beads around my neck. If you pushed me on the stage, I got to the state of, if you pushed me onto the stage, I could hold my own. I could do anything. You became very, very adept, because the young ladies in the Windmill Theatre were not always particularly talented performers. They were there because of their shape and size. And people have often asked me about the Windmill. The rules and regulations in England at that time was that you were not allowed to appear naked on the stage unless you stood stock still. So that Van Damme arranged that every time the curtains parted, there upstage on a plinth was a very beautiful young lady, quite naked. But she just stood like a statue while the dancing and the action of the musical comedy numbers went on in front of her. Then the curtains closed, and then the curtains opened, and there'd be another girl standing there, you see. But it was a hard job, but it gave me the opportunity for every 3 lots of shows, Freda and I would go to Europe. So I went to Preobrazhenska for lessons in Paris, and it gave us a very comfortable means of living.
What about, Harold, when you did a dance or you sang and the woman wore this beautiful outfit and there was nothing on underneath?
That's right.
Yes.
Oh yes, I have a lovely photograph of a beautiful girl. She had a lovely big crinoline dress on. And I'm singing my heart out, you know. But of course it was a great success, because she was naked underneath. But that's how it was at the Windmill, you see. It was like that. And I recall too that I used to do an absolutely breathtaking Spanish dance with a young lady called Jubina Milhus. And Jubina and I were in great demand at private clubs who would ring the mill and say, would you put on the floor show? So Jubina and I would rush off to different clubs and do our marvelously exciting Spanish number. She played the castanets beautifully. And we always got tremendous applause, and I often wondered about this because I didn't think I was a very great Spanish dancer, but I wore a beautiful costume and I did all the prescribed things, you know. But one day, through circumstance, I saw her in rehearsal, and as she danced, and every time she did a little jeté or a little jump on the stage, her bosom would go boom, boom, up and down like that. No wonder the men must have adored it. Her titties were never still for 1 minute. No wonder we were a great success. You know?
Oh.
Awful, awful.
Never mind. I've got a photo of it.
Restaged a masque of Milton called Everyman, and I had a wonderful brief role as a young bridegroom in a magnificent tight-fitting black velvet costume, and his bride in a wonderful medieval costume, and they danced together just fleetingly, but Death, who was played by Henry Algeranoff, floated by, trailing yards and yards of charcoal and grey chiffon and net. It was like the shadow of death passing by, and the beautiful bride dies, and she's lying dead in the footlights. and I was off stage, and Mona Inglesby came up to me and she said, "Are you enjoying being in London, Harold?" And I said, "Oh yes, Miss Inglesby, it's very exciting being at the Colosseum." And she quite quietly said, "Joyce Gearing has been lying dead on the footlights for the last 20 minutes. I'd quite forgotten in my role I had to